One of the most important survival crops of the Second World War was not wheat, not corn, and not rice. It was a root most people today treat as animal fodder or, just ignore entirely. In occupied Europe it fed entire villages. In bombed cities it kept children alive through winters when supply chains collapsed. Governments devoted acreage, research, and even propaganda to it. But after the war, it quietly disappeared from serious discussion. If you value in-depth historical analysis that goes beyond battlefield maps and into the systems that actually kept societies alive, you should subscribe to the Survival Record, because today we're examining a plant that once stood between civilians and famine, the humble rutabaga. We tend to think of wartime food shortages in broad terms: rationing, victory gardens, ersatz coffee. But in large parts of Europe, especially in Germany, Poland, Scandinavia, and the occupied territories, the rutabaga, known in German as Steckrübe, became the backbone of civilian survival. During the First World War, Germany even endured what became known as the Turnip Winter of 1916 to 1917, when failed potato harvests forced millions to rely almost entirely on turnips and rutabagas. That trauma lingered in memory. When the Second World War began, planners remembered it. By 1939, German agricultural authorities were not improvising. Under the Food Administration apparatus tied to the four-year plan, officials had studied which crops could endure blockades, poor soil, and minimal fertilizer. Rutabagas had advantages that really mattered under wartime constraints. They were cold-hardy, capable of remaining in the ground late into autumn. They produced high yields per acre compared to many grains. They could grow in marginal soils less suitable for wheat. And they stored well in root cellars without refrigeration. This was not a glamorous crop, it was a strategic one. In a war defined by mechanized offensives and industrial output, food security was as decisive as oil. The Allied naval blockade in both world wars made clear that Germany could not rely on imported grain and fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer production helped, but it was energy-intensive and vulnerable to bombing. Root crops like rutabagas required less nitrogen input than grain-heavy systems. They also converted calories into bulk efficiently, making them suitable for stretching rations. By 1942 and 1943, as Allied bombing intensified and rail networks were repeatedly disrupted, urban populations across Europe became dependent on what could be grown locally and transported short distances. Rutabagas, cabbage, and potatoes dominated these emergency food systems, but potatoes were vulnerable to blight and required careful storage. Rutabagas were more forgiving. In occupied Poland and parts of the Soviet Union under German control, large estates were reorganized to prioritize calorie-dense crops that could feed both occupying forces and local laborers. While much of this produce was requisitioned, local survival often depended on what could be hidden, gleaned, or grown in small plots. Rutabagas thrived in such conditions. They were difficult to detect from a distance compared to tall grain fields and could be intercropped or planted on the margins of fields. For civilians, rutabagas became a symbol of monotony and deprivation. Diaries from Berlin in 1944 and 1945 describe soups thickened with mashed rutabaga bread mixed with small amounts of rye flour, even coffee substitutes derived from roasted slices. In Scandinavia, particularly in rural Norway under occupation, rutabagas and other root vegetables formed the core of winter sustenance when imports were restricted and livestock feed was scarce. Yet from a survival perspective, the plant was remarkably effective. A single acre could yield many tons of edible root. The leaves could feed animals, preserving limited grain for human consumption. The roots could be sliced thin and dried, extending shelf life further. In communities with limited fuel, rutabagas required relatively short cooking times compared to some dried legumes. In Britain, where the naval blockade ran in the opposite direction, the government's Dig for Victory campaign encouraged root vegetables precisely because they maximized calories per square yard. While carrots and potatoes received more publicity, swedes, the British term for rutabagas, were common in allotments. They were dependable. In a system where shipping space was prioritized for munitions and oil, domestic calories were a form of strategic independence. What is often overlooked is how these wartime agricultural adaptations influenced later military doctrine. Modern military logistics recognizes food as a strategic vulnerability. During the early Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact planners studied civilian resilience under bombardment. The memory of root cellar storage, decentralized food production, and hardy crops fed into civil defense planning. Survival manuals from the 1950s and 1960s routinely recommended root vegetables for household preparedness because they required minimal infrastructure. The rutabaga fit that doctrine almost perfectly. It did not require greenhouses or specialized seed stock. It tolerated cold climates. It could be left in the ground and harvested as needed, reducing storage losses. For survivalists today, these traits should sound familiar. So, why did we stop growing it at scale? The answer is less about agriculture and more about psychology and economics. After 1945, Europe and North America entered an era defined by abundance, industrial agriculture, and expanding global trade. Wheat yields soared with new fertilizers and hybrid varieties. Refrigeration and trucking transformed supply chains. Consumers, traumatized by years of monotony and rationing, rejected foods associated with deprivation. In Germany especially, the memory of the Turnip Winter and later wartime shortages made rutabagas a symbol of humiliation and hunger. Farmers responded to markets. Supermarkets favored uniform produce with predictable consumer demand. Rutabagas, dense and irregular, lost shelf space to more profitable crops. Industrial livestock operations shifted toward grain-heavy feed systems supported by subsidized corn and soy. Root crops that once supported mixed farming systems became secondary. There were also structural changes. Post-war urbanization reduced the number of households maintaining root cellars. Central heating replaced cool basements ideal for long-term storage. As food systems centralized, the knowledge required to grow and preserve hardy winter crops faded from common practice. By the late 20th century, rutabaga survived mostly in regional cuisines, Scandinavian stews, British roasts, certain Eastern European dishes. The plant that had once sustained cities under siege became a culinary footnote. This shift carries consequences that extend beyond nostalgia. Modern food systems are extraordinarily productive but highly specialized. They depend on fossil fuels for fertilizer, transport, and refrigeration. They rely on just-in-time logistics. When disruptions occur, whether from conflict, natural disaster, or economic instability, the system's efficiency can become a liability. During the Second World War, communities that retained diversified cropping systems and storage knowledge proved more resilient. Rutabagas were not a miracle crop. They were part of a broader pattern, favoring hardy, calorie-dense plants that reduced dependence on fragile supply chains. It is also worth noting that modern climate variability may reintroduce conditions in which such crops regain relevance. Rutabagas tolerate frost better than many vegetables. They perform in shorter growing seasons and poor soils. In northern latitudes, where climate shifts are unpredictable, that resilience has practical value. For survival-minded viewers, the lesson is not to romanticize wartime diets. Malnutrition and hunger were real and often severe. Rather, the lesson lies in redundancy and adaptability. Governments that anticipated blockade conditions and invested in suitable crops mitigated disaster. Households that understood storage and seasonal eating endured hardship with fewer external inputs. In both world wars, the decisive factor was not simply what armies did at the front. It was whether civilians could continue functioning behind the lines. Food stability influenced morale, labor output, and political cohesion. Rutabagas, unremarkable as they seem, contributed quietly to that stability. We stopped growing them widely because abundance made them unfashionable. But history suggests that unfashionable does not mean unimportant. Crops fall in and out of favor, according to market signals, not necessarily strategic wisdom. The broader question is whether we have allowed short-term preference to override long-term resilience. In studying the agricultural adjustments of the Second World War, we see a model of pragmatic decision-making under constraint. Officials prioritized yield, storage life, and caloric density over taste and variety. Civilians adapted cooking methods to what was available. Communities relearned skills that industrialization had begun to erode. That pattern repeats across conflicts. When supply chains fracture, societies return to fundamentals: what grows reliably, what stores safely, and what sustains labor through winter. The rutabaga stands as a case study in that logic. It fed villages not because it was beloved, but because it was dependable. It survived frost, poor soil, and transport delays. It bridged the gap between harvest and spring. In doing so, it helped maintain civilian populations through one of the most destructive wars in human history. Remembering that matters, not because we expect history to repeat itself in identical form, but because the constraints that shaped wartime decisions, blockade, scarcity, disrupted infrastructure, remain possible in different contexts. Understanding how previous generations responded provides a framework for evaluating our own vulnerabilities. If you value this kind of detailed, grounded exploration of overlooked wartime realities, subscribe to The Survival Record. Share this video with others who care about serious historical analysis and practical lessons drawn from the past. These quieter stories, the crops, the storage cellars, the decisions made far from the front, are often the ones that explain how societies endure.